Scott, and today I'm going to be talking to you about building stronger teams for better user experience. Now my job title, please come in. My job title says that I do user experience design and research, but I'm actually going to start by admitting that that's not really what I do. I'm not a user experience designer. I do user-focused design, I do human-centered design, whatever it is that you want to call it, but I can't really do user experience design. Now, we may all have people on our teams that call themselves, much like me, user experience designers. But I'm going to make a bold statement. I'm going to say that if we've come here today to learn more, if we're at a conference like this, if we're watching a talk like this, then it's probably because we're all striving for that great user experience, regardless of what our role is, that we all care about producing things that are good for our end users. Which makes this job title a bit of a problem, because actually we all care about it, and we're all making decisions every day that can affect that user experience. We're all doing user experience design, whether we realize it or not. Because an experience is a massive thing, and many more people than just user experience designers make up the experience that a user has. We have front-end developers, back-end developers, product managers, quality assurance, sysadmins, user researchers, DevOps, and then we have people who might not even be on our immediate teams. For example, the brand designers, the copywriters, the marketing team, our clients, even customer services can have a real impact on the way someone experiences a product or service that we've built. And this isn't even the whole list of people who might influence the user experience. And the reality is that all of these people, all of these roles, are responsible for part of the user experience. When any of these people do their jobs, anytime they make a decision, anytime we do our jobs, anytime we make a decision, we are designing that experience, whether we realize it or not. So I can't be a user experience designer, because user experience is clearly a team sport. As an individual, I can't control or design for that whole experience on my own. I need that massive collective of people to help me uphold the vision of user experience that hopefully we all share. So this tells us that successful design doesn't happen in isolation. We require teams focused on the same goals, with the same vision for that user experience. But then the problem comes that teams don't always function well together. Designers disagree with developers, and project managers fall out with clients. So how exactly do we achieve that cohesiveness to be able to create our cohesive user experience? Well, before I talk a little bit more about that, I want to clarify. When I talk about user experience, I'm not talking about user interface. I mean genuinely every decision we make when we are designing or building a product or service. Now, there are the more obvious UX-y things like front-end interactions, user journeys, the UI design itself, our accessibility standards, things that are clearly user-facing. But then there are the things that seem less user-facing, more developer-facing, such as our application architecture, our coding standards, our test coverage, our Git workflow, and our naming conventions. And each of these things, although they don't seem like it, are design decisions. And they're design decisions about interface or process or the structure of what we build and how we build it. And each decision can have an effect on the user experience at the end of the day. For example, if our coding standards aren't followed, it can take us longer to fix bugs and longer to improve and roll out existing features. if our application architecture doesn't work at scale, then our application might become unstable for the people who are using it. And if our test coverage is spotty, we might break critical features that our users rely on without even realizing it. Now, we make these design decisions at the beginning of a project with our teams with the best intent. But I think sometimes we find over time that our teams stop quite adhering to them in the way that we intended those decisions in the first place. And the less visible those decisions, the less user-facing they seem, the easier it is for inconsistencies to creep in. And once we have one or two inconsistencies, they tend to stack up over time. So how do we convince colleagues that these things are important? That they are, in fact, user experience design decisions that, when agreed on, should be adhered to? Well, over my career, I've worked with quite a lot of teams. Some of them have been very functional, they've produced very good work, they've worked very well together. And some of them haven't been quite as functional. They haven't worked very well together and they haven't produced quite as good outcomes. I've also had the privilege of building teams from scratch myself. And as a freelancer, I now get dropped into organizations and dropped into teams and have to deal with however their team is functioning at that particular point in time. Sometimes I have to spend quite a lot of time getting that team to work better together before we can really get started on the project at hand. But in my experience of all the teams that I've worked with, the ones that produce the best work, the ones that have the best outcomes, are the ones that are working towards a clear vision. But in order to have that clear vision, we need good leadership. And this is where the second problem comes in. Because for most of us sitting here, we aren't the people in charge. We probably wouldn't consider ourselves leaders. We don't get to dictate the direction of the products or services or projects that we're working on. And we probably wouldn't consider that we have the option of becoming leaders anytime soon. But the idea that leadership is top-down, that it has to be top-down, is a widely held mistruth. Now, there's a quote that sums this up perfectly for me. Too many people view management as leadership. It's not. Leadership comes from influence, and influence can come from anyone at any level and in any role. So I believe that we don't have to rely on our managers to provide all of the leadership that we need in our teams. And I believe that if we all learn the traits of good leadership, then we can build better teams and stronger UX as a result by applying those traits to our everyday interactions with our colleagues and clients. Because this isn't really about being a manager or having the power to hire and fire. It's about using that personal positive influence to work towards a common goal, to help our colleagues to work towards a common goal. So I'm going to talk about 3 leadership qualities today and how we can use those qualities to build stronger teams and as a result have that better, more consistent, more beautiful user experience. Now, the first quality that I'd like to talk about is empathy. Getting groups of people excited about an idea requires understanding what motivates them. And a good leader is empathetic. They understand our individual needs. They understand us as people. They know that we have different strengths and weaknesses, different needs and motivations and aims. They listen to our expertise. A good leader rarely says, "This is the way we're going to do it," and that's just the end of the conversation. They trust their team, and they listen to what they have to say. And they listen to, and more importantly, prioritize our concerns. If we're pushing back on something or we seem uncomfortable, they will take the time to understand why that might be. Our concerns represent barriers to us delivering our work. And for any good leader, it should be a priority to break those barriers down. So what happens when you don't have empathy in a leader or in your teammates? Well, a strange thing happens when we genuinely have empathy in a team. Everyone ends up feeling heard and understood. And this has the side effect of meaning that people will buy in to a decision, even if it's been hotly debated, and even if it doesn't go their way, because they'll feel that their points have been really considered. Now, the problem comes if they feel that they haven't been heard, if they feel like they haven't been listened to, if they feel that their points haven't been considered. In that situation, they may feel forced into a commitment that they don't want to, or perhaps don't really intend to keep to. And when that happens, we end up with lack of commitment to decision-making in our teams. Now, if we're suffering from lack of commitment to decision-making in our teams, you might hear things like this. I decided not to do it that way in the end. The developer didn't follow my design. I told the designer we couldn't do it that way anyway. And I thought someone else was doing that. Because when we have a lack of commitment, we also have a lack of accountability. No one's going to take responsibility for those decisions because no one wanted to make them in the first place. So, what can we do to combat this? Well, we can use empathy to connect with our colleagues. And before you take a moment and think that that sounds a lot like the warm and fuzzies, for anyone who's working in a user-focused team, for anyone who's working in a human-centered team, for anyone who's working on a product team, think about how much energy we put in every day to putting ourselves in our users' shoes. Think about how much energy we put in to being user-focused in the way we produce our work. And then think about how much energy you put into doing the same thing, to being empathetic in that way with your clients and colleagues. Because I can tell you, no matter how good the teams are that I've worked with, the standard is never the same. We are much more empathetic to our users than we are to our clients and colleagues. So this isn't about the warm and fuzzies. Empathy is genuinely at the core of any effective team. In fact, I'd argue that it's at the core of any effective business. Because if you don't know what your users want and you don't know what your staff need, your business isn't going to last very long. So we can use empathy to connect with our colleagues. And we can understand what motivates them. What does a good outcome look like for them? What do they love doing and what do they hate doing? We can take the time to understand their concerns. If they're pushing back on a suggestion, rather than getting upset that someone doesn't agree with us, we can take the time to understand why. We can really ask that question, why? It might be that they don't actually understand how to implement what you're suggesting. Or perhaps they have a more valid technical concern, but they're struggling to articulate it. Either way, in order for us to proceed, it's important for us to understand the concerns of the other person. Fundamentally, this is about considering our colleagues' needs in the same way we would consider our users' needs. What do they actually care about? And how can we show that we understand those needs and concerns so that they feel understood and listened to, so that we can fulfill those needs? By doing this, by applying empathy to our clients and colleagues, we can ensure that everyone is genuinely on board with the decisions we make because we're making those decisions together. And by doing that, we avoid team members delivering to their own specification, and we create real commitment to decision making. Because if we don't have that commitment, then there's no way we can create consistent UX, because we haven't really agreed what kind of UX it is we want to create. The next quality I'd like to talk about is direction and focus. Now, you might call this vision, or you might call it strategy. The greatest leaders mobilize others by coalescing people around a shared vision. And a good leader sets that strategy or direction and focus. They communicate goals. They don't communicate details. This is high level. They don't micromanage. They allow people to use their own problem-solving skills, and they're open to alternative solutions. They're open to alternative ways to meet that vision or strategy that they've laid down. They take the time to explain why those goals are important. What is the business value? What is the value for our users? Why are we focusing on this goal over any other? They help us to understand the why of what we're trying to achieve over the what of how we're going to do it. And they're open to change when change is necessary. Sometimes we just end up going in the wrong direction, or the wind changes in the industry and we need to follow that new direction. And a leader is flexible. They are open to signals that they may need to change, and they're responsive to them. But what happens when you have no direction and focus in your team or in your leadership? Well, when we have no clear strategy, we only have our own personal opinions to rely on. And inevitably, personal opinions don't always align. I'm sure we've all had the circular arguments/conversations where we can't quite seem to agree with a colleague. And this makes collective decision-making about any kind of decision, no matter how big or small, almost impossible, because we have no objective purpose to focus on. And so we end up in conflict. And if we're in conflict, we might hear things like this from our clients, who might feel like we don't have anything to add to the conversation. I know what my own customers want. This is best practice. This is the best get out ever. There's no need to explain why it's important. It's just how it's been done, how it is done. You might get people pulling rank because I've been doing it this way for 10 years. This is just how we do it. And this next one, I know you've probably all done this with clients at some point. I will put up my hand and admit that I have too. Random technobabble to justify not doing something that you don't really want to do. It won't work because of the flux capacitor. So what can we do to avoid this kind of conflict? Well, this one's actually pretty straightforward. We can set goals for our own work. Now, this isn't about setting strategy for the whole project. We've already said not all of us have the capacity to do that. It's about ensuring that each decision that we make, that we have control over, has a purpose and meets that overall strategy that's been set down. It's about why are we making this decision, what do we think it will achieve, and how are we going to measure it? So don't wait for someone else to define the goal that you're trying to reach. Take the initiative. You may have been given a brief, but make sure that you really know what success looks like for the feature or product that you're delivering. And discuss it with your team. Ensure your team has the same purpose in mind as they're designing or developing. Once you have those goals, you can then define metrics and measures to measure your success. How will you know if you've achieved that goal? And how will you know if you aren't achieving it? And if something isn't working, you can be the person to stand up and say, let's change it. If you find that the feature you built isn't delivering, and you'll know this because of the metrics that you've set, or perhaps the wind has just changed in the industry and we all need to react, you can be the person to stand up and say, we can make this user experience better. When we clarify goals, we clarify our team understanding of what it is we're trying to reach for, and we clarify our own understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve. But perhaps more importantly, by defining those goals, we can then define the metrics. And when we define a metric, we collectively agree on an impersonal measure. This means that we don't have to rely on the personal opinions in our team anymore, the personal opinions that lead us into those circular conversations and into conflict. And this really does help us to foster a better breeding ground for user-focused design. Because once we've agreed these metrics, once we've agreed these measures and goals, we really are focusing on things that we all agree matter to our user experience, as opposed to the things that matter to us. The last quality that I'm going to talk about is collaboration. Individual commitment to a group effort. That is what makes a team work. And a good leader facilitates collaboration. They make space for new ideas to be considered, and by doing so, they encourage growth and innovation in their teams. They empower teams to make their own decisions. They don't put projects through unnecessary or arduous sign-off. They trust the people that they work with. And they don't claim personal credit for successes, but they do take responsibility for failures. So what happens when we don't have functional collaboration in our teams? Well, good leaders take the blame on themselves and they distribute credit to others. And when that isn't happening, a blame culture can evolve. And if you're suffering with a blame culture, you might hear things like this. The feature description was unclear. It wasn't my fault that I did it the wrong way. That bug is definitely her fault. It's the back end that's slow, not my JavaScript. And quality assurance should have checked that. Because when you're worried about being blamed, you'll hoard all of the successes that you can. And you'll shy away from anything that might mean you have to take responsibility for something that's gone wrong. But by doing that, we end up focusing on the merits or failures of individuals rather than the potential strengths of the team. But we can each choose to facilitate collaboration when we work with our teams. We can each take responsibility for making sure this works. We can make sure that we are open to feedback and new ideas, even when it's difficult to hear that someone doesn't agree that you've done it the way they would have done, or perhaps there's a better solution than the one that you found. We can be open to constructive criticism. Now, we all talk about the rockstar developer, and we joke about it a lot, but that attitude in a team member is genuinely damaging to collaboration. Because it all becomes about that person's expertise, about that person's achievements, not about the strength or the achievements of the team. A good team member, a functional team member, puts their ego aside and puts the team first. We can also facilitate collaboration by choosing to focus our communication on what is relevant to the team member that we're talking to. Now, teams are made up of people with different expertise and skills, and the way that we need to talk to them may vary depending on their exact skill set or job role. And we do this for our users all the time, right? We write copy that is appropriate for our users. We understand what they need. We're empathetic towards what they need to hear in order to buy a product or understand a concept. And we don't do this very often with our colleagues. If we're talking to project managers, sometimes we don't take a minute to stop and think, actually, does our project manager just need to know how long this is going to take because they need to cost it for a client? Or should I also tell them all of the technical detail? But if we're talking to a developer, then they probably don't care how long exactly it's going to take to deliver. They want to know how. How are we going to deliver this? What technology will we use? How are we going to make sure that it works the best way that it can? So this is about prioritizing what the person you're speaking to needs and wants to hear to get the concept across, rather than the things that are in our brains that we feel like we need to express. This is being user-focused in the way that we communicate with our clients and colleagues. We can also facilitate collaboration by admitting our mistakes and crediting others' successes. When we own up to our mistakes, our colleagues know that we can be trusted to tell the truth. And when we credit others' successes, even if we feel like we contributed to them, we show that we value the input of our colleagues. We prove to them that we aren't the rockstar developer that is just in it for themselves. And by doing both of those things, we can help to derail blame culture and make it actually possible for our team to collaborate and work together in the way that is needed to produce that consistent UX. So, in conclusion, be empathetic. When something doesn't go as planned, take the time to genuinely understand why. Use that knowledge to avoid lack of commitment to decision making in your team, to those future design decisions that you're going to make. Make sure everyone has genuinely bought into the idea, that they understand the idea, and that they're on board with it. Set direction and focus for the things that you're working on. Set goals for your own work, for the features that you're working on, to clarify the direction that has been set down elsewhere, to clarify the strategy that you're working towards, and measure those goals. Avoid the conflict that comes from incompatible individual opinions. We can have these independent metrics. We can have these metrics that we all agree on. And when we have those metrics, we don't need to have conflict anymore. We don't need to have the circular arguments that we all have when we have slightly differing opinions on how to go about something. But do take the initiative to set those goals yourself, or to ask someone to help you to set those goals if they're not being given to you. I don't see enough designers and developers doing this yet. I don't see enough people saying, you've given me a brief, but I don't really understand the purpose. I don't really understand what success looks like. So take the time to have that conversation with your product owner or project manager or boss. And facilitate collaboration. Choose to facilitate collaboration. Don't be the rockstar developer. Commit yourself to the success of the team rather than just your individual success. And avoid the blame culture that stops others from making that same commitment by admitting your mistakes and crediting other people's successes. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is using our own behavior, our own personal positive influence to help your team to work towards the same goal being that same vision of user experience that we have. And I know that when something goes wrong on a project, like coding standards being ignored, or test coverage becoming spotty, it's tempting to get a little bit angry and to fix that with stricter rules, regulations and policies, to write longer, better documentation, or perhaps just to leave shitty commit messages. And I've done that one too. But helping your team to work towards the same goal isn't about writing longer or better documentation. It's not about writing stricter rules and policies. And it's most certainly not about laying blame with an individual. It's about understanding our colleagues as individuals and understanding on a case-by-case basis why things went wrong and what we can change to do it better next time. It's not about leaving responsibility for that problem with the one person in the team, because a team is a unit and we have to work together for things to function. A team is a system, and a system is made up of multiple parts. Because we can't design a better user experience if we don't each take responsibility for our influence over the user experience. No matter what role we work in, we all have influence over that user experience. And we can't design better user experience if we don't agree what direction we're going in. Because if we're all going in different directions, then we aren't all designing for the same user experience. And we can't design a better user experience if we don't acknowledge that we can't do it alone. We need that massive collective of people that we saw at the beginning to work with us, to help us to uphold our collective vision of what good user experience looks like. So for me, creating better UX is about building stronger teams and choosing to be better colleagues. And ultimately, whether we're junior developers or managing directors, that is something that we each have the power to do. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you for the great talk. I wanted to ask a question. How do you kind of criticize a team member that is doing something wrong for the team, but actually in the case where this team member is not doing work that's directly related to what you do? I mean, the faraway goal is the same, okay? But you know that this guy is doing something kind of wrong. Maybe he's not following a best practice, but not just about the best practice. You know you can explain, you can argument why the best practice is actually the best, and you want to say you are doing something wrong for the team. How do you put that?
What's the impact of this person having done something wrong?
Well, it's not that big, okay, but it could be big.
Okay.
I mean.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's important that if we are going to have those discussions with people, we need to be able to explain the impact. I think wrong, I don't know if you saw James's talk earlier, but he made a very good argument for the fact that wrong can be very particular to the situation that we're in. And unless we can explain the impact on our users, the impact on the maintainability of the service to improve it for our users, then perhaps it isn't wrong in the way that we think it is. But if we genuinely believe that there is a problem in the way that someone is doing something, sometimes it's better to have that conversation as a team rather than to have it with the individual. So if we're saying, actually, this is wrong, we know it's wrong because we can quantify these reasons, perhaps this should go in our coding standards, perhaps this should go in our style for the project, perhaps this should be something that we work within. And that becomes a collective decision rather than two people with different personal opinions having that discussion. So if you can have that discussion as a team and you can prove the impact, then I think that's often a much better way to go about it than having it with the individual.
Okay, so don't have a conversation one-to-one, but actually include that thing in the coding standards and explain it as a team.
I think if everyone agrees that it should be in the coding standards, if you have a discussion about it and you go, actually, I'm not sure about this, I think this is the impact, and everyone agrees, then that's great. But that's about having everyone on board with the decisions, like we said earlier. So we've got that commitment to decision making, right? But that in order for that commitment to exist, we have to have that conversation as a group. We have to agree it as a group. So I think have open the question rather than start with the answer. Open the question to the team and say, is this a problem or is it not? Have that discussion, and then everyone will either agree or they won't.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
No worries.
I have one question. There was one question? No, I have one for you. When you said you can be a leader, but not necessarily a manager, so this means that you are under a lot of pressure because you're in a strange position. You are not supposed to take decisions, you're not supposed to drive. But clearly you have a very strong self-confidence, and this is required by this position. So it's something like comes natural because that's the way you are, or maybe you do some course, or maybe you read some books. So how do you achieve this level of confidence and drive without being out from the authority giving the head of, you drive?
I think I think the roles that we're given, the job titles that we're given, very often don't match up with the influence we have within the team. And you may have found that you work within a particular team and someone might be officially the manager, but actually someone else is the influencer, right? Someone else is the one that actually pushes perhaps the coding standards in a particular direction, or pushes the discussion or the argument in a particular direction. And I think our roles and our responsibilities are not the same as the influence we have, or the potential influence that we have over the people that we work with. And this is about actually saying, I have got the ability to influence it, and not only I'm going to choose to use that influence in a way that is centered around communicating with people, understanding what people's problems or issues really are, and working with that rather than working against it, but actually I'm going to use that power for good. Rather than being the loudest person in the room, rather than just shouting over the top of other people, I'm actually going to actively listen to what other people are saying, and I'm going to impart my influence in that way, and hopefully get them to impart their influence too. A lot of this is about leveling the playing field so that we don't have managers telling us what to do, and we don't have that one team member who's more influential than the other, who may or may not be the rockstar developer. But I think the first thing that we have to do actually is listen to what other people are saying without opening our mouths. Because that gives us the context to be able to understand the problem. We're all very good at problem solving, we're developers, that's what we do. But actually a lot of the time when we're communicating on a personal level, we don't stop to understand the problem we're trying to solve, we just go straight in with the loud voices and arguments.
Yeah, but again, is this self-confidence is something that you are born with, or it's something you can
I think that you don't necessarily...
You are a leader or you become a leader?
I think this is about applying leadership skills,
Okay.
and I think that's not necessarily the same as being a leader. It's about understanding the things that leaders do to make it better for other people. I think some people find it easier to just naturally fall into a leadership role, but actually that's perhaps not true. Some people find it easier to fall into an influencer role, but they don't always use those powers for good. And I think I've been that person in the past, where actually I have been the loudest voice. And I think we've probably all got people on our teams who are like that. But that's not the same as leadership, and it's not necessarily related to self-confidence in terms of how we use leadership skills to communicate with our team members better.
Other questions? Yep.
Yes. My question is, what if, and I think this is a common situation, there is a person in the team that has a negative influence on the team and on the workflow, and everyone in the team agree on this.
Okay.
But nobody can, let's say, put this person out of the team because nobody is a manager, and maybe the manager isn't able to change the team.
Okay.
So what do you do to improve the work and the project?
Sure. I would start by trying to understand why they are having a negative, not what they're doing, but why they are having that negative influence on the team.
Okay.
And I would also consider the fact that because everyone feels like they're having a negative influence on the team, they may be collectively reinforcing that behavior.
Yeah.
Because if someone feels like the outsider, they don't feel like they've bought into decisions, we're not all going to be on board with the decisions that we're making, we're then leading to conflict, all of these symptoms that we saw happen, but they happen to one individual rather than to the whole team. So I think the first thing is to understand why it is they feel like they're doing things differently, why it's good for them to do things differently, why they feel left out, why they aren't, engaging in the same way that other team members do. And then I think it's actually on the rest of the team to go, we need to give this person a chance, we need to talk to them and actually genuinely listen to their concerns, and see whether or not we can collectively make it better without accidentally sort of pushing this person to the sidelines. And if after that it still doesn't work, well, sometimes we will end up in working situations and damage happens in terms of the way that we communicate with other people or the things that happen to us while we're working in those organizations. Sometimes we can't fix that damage because it's difficult to rebuild the trust. And it might be that that's the case, in which case you do need a manager to step in. But I think the first thing to do is to understand why the problem is genuinely happening, rather than looking at the symptoms of the problem and getting frustrated by it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions that we can do. Is that? Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Thanks very much.